And we'd like to welcome Kevin on stage and also Ben with a very special first-time appearance that probably for the first time Ben is not joining a panel with his flute-like instrument. Give it up.
No. Whoa.
Hello, there we go. What's up, guys? Today we're going to talk about public goods, funding them, but also with layer twos. I'm joined by Kevin from Gitcoin and Ben from Optimism. And you guys I'm not going to be able to introduce you better than you can introduce yourselves. So if you could please do that. Kevin, you want to start with yourself?
Yeah, I'm Kevin Olsen, not Kevin Owocki, just a quick disabbreviation. So I'm the workstream lead of the Gitcoin Product Collective. We're the product and engineering group inside the Gitcoin DAO. So we're building Gitcoin Passport and the Gitcoin Grants protocol.
And Ben, who are you?
What's going on, y'all? I am Ben from Optimism, one of the co-founders and on the Optimism Foundation now. And we're here to build public goods, baby.
Hell yeah.
Who are you, David?
I'm David. I produce content. And I produce a lot of it. And I try and do it every second of the day.
Influencer.
Educator first, hopefully. Influencer second. Okay, I want to start off with a higher level question. Layer twos and public goods. Why are these in the same sentence? Where is the intersection between these things? Ben, I'll start with you.
First of all, layer twos are public goods. Okay, I mean, there's a lot of layers that you can, no pun intended. There's a lot of aspects to that you can unpack, right? So for one, it is true that at least for correctly permissioned software, layer twos are public goods, right? These represent code bases, and very, very importantly, they represent very easy to spin up chains because you can borrow the consensus and the security from a layer one. So I would say even more so than a layer one code base in some way, a layer two code base is a public good because they can be used by more people. Yeah.
And zeroing in on that a little bit more, just to make the question more precise, funding public goods and layer twos, how do these conversations intersect?
So how does funding public goods and layer twos intersect? So, I mean, that depends on what layer two you're talking about. Mm-hmm. For us, it's extremely core to what we're doing. Mm-hmm. I would argue that it is a prerogative or a responsibility that we have, not just in layer twos, which I think is like, a little too in the weeds, and people in 10 years aren't going to think of themselves as on a layer 2 or a layer 3 or a layer Z. They're just going to think about themselves as using these new forms of applications. But I do think it's very important that we use this opportunity of the new kind of software that's eating the world to do good for the world. So very broadly, it's, I think, in some sense a prerogative. Like you could make a closed source layer 2, but we shouldn't.
And just to drill down on this a little bit more, Optimism from like day one has always been leading with public goods and funding public goods. And that's kind of been the Optimism brand for what the Optimism Layer 2 is here to do. Not only is it here to scale Ethereum, but it's also kind of here to scale public goods. And sometimes it feels like it's the scaling of public goods that's actually the main goal of Optimism at times. Why such a strong commitment to funding public goods? Why is that such a core value proposition of a Layer 2?
Yeah, so obviously these things are very related, as we started off with. For Optimism story in particular, so actually when we very first started off, before optimistic rollups really existed as a class of thing, there was something called Plasma, and this is something that's finally re-emerging in the layer 3 world, which is very exciting. It was a bit ahead of its time in some sense, but we started a nonprofit called Plasma Group, and the goal was basically to build good Plasma designs and release them for all the projects that wanted to build scaling solutions. And what we quickly found was that even though it was a very compelling thing for us to be doing, and we saw other projects directly using our designs and implementing them in their own code bases, we had a really hard time getting funding, right? We were a nonprofit, and basically we had to go and beg for money from, in the form of donations. And it kind of felt like, this is crap. There's all this money going to tokens and the application layer. Why is it the case that we're building something that's so fundamental to what everyone else is going to be doing and not able to get funded? So when we made the decision to spin down the nonprofit and go for profit, we said, we have to be the last ones to have to make this change. People should get paid to build public goods. So I don't know. It's core to our, to our story, and I think it's, like I said, a responsibility that we have.
Mm-hmm. Now, Kevin, turning the conversation to Gitcoin a little bit, there's going to be many chains, new chains, beyond the Ethereum layer 1. And Gitcoin is an application layer, so it doesn't really exist on any one particular chain. But there's going to be a Cambrian explosion. We're already kind of seeing it of many different layer 2s. How is Gitcoin interfacing with all of these different chains, and how does that relate to what Gitcoin's mission is?
Yeah, so this is, it's a ever-expanding surface area. So from an engineering perspective, we're just redeploying the contracts for the protocol on each L2. It's ideally there would be some better tooling, I think, to make cross L2 tooling work a little bit better. But right now, it really is just on the burden of the application layer to basically go kind of community by community, layer 2 by layer 2. And interestingly enough, I think the alignment with Optimism has probably been what's driven us to start with that, right? So our first deployment is on Optimism, working on RPGF2. And I think the plan with Gitcoin is to stay values aligned with the groups that we're working with. We're not deploying to be a general service necessarily as we start, but really to work with these individual groups that support public goods, that want to be funding them, and seeding capital into their ecosystems, right, to really grow those communities.
Right. What lessons can we take from the early days of Gitcoin, like rounds 1 through 5, which was very much an experiment for the whole entire ecosystem? Now Gitcoin rounds are pretty damn polished and refined, but now we're getting into layer 2 funding. So what lessons, how are we accelerating what we've already learned taking the lessons from the layer 1?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for us is don't build a single monolithic code base, even if it's the fastest way to do something. We're definitely in this process of modularizing Gitcoin and bringing it out really as a protocol. All of this is kind of getting talked about. We're not doing a great job of talking about it. We're mostly just working with partners directly to help kind of bootstrap their first kind of protocol-driven grants rounds. Lessons there, I think, are, there's a lot, man. We've learned so many things. What's hard about running open grants rounds with quadratic funding? Sybil attacks, right? You have to have some sort of stronger sense of identity. So you see all kinds of experiments there over the years with building up trust bonus and now passport. Grant curation is super hard, right? People are trying to create fraudulent grants and building up an ecosystem where you can detect that or bring better data signals into the people who have to make decisions, who are curating their grants round and deciding what projects are valid for their community. There's so much that we've learned through that, a lot of it through human effort, and that's going into the protocol and through our tooling to make that a bit more easy. I want to say automated, but definitely putting people where they have the right tools to make the right decisions.
How does the fact that these layer 2 teams are just a little bit easier to actually interface with versus Ethereum layer 1 governance, right? So you can go talk to the Optimism team. Ben's right here. We can go talk to the Arbitrum team. How does that change? Does that change any way of the way that Gitcoin operates on these layer 2s?
I think what's interesting about this is I think most of the layer 2s probably are in still sort of the bootstrapping of a community, and I think public goods funding is a great way to do that, right? You're I don't want to get too abstract here, but what is funding public goods? The closest corollary you have is sort of taxation, right? You're thinking about actually funding what bridges and roads and clean water. This is where the public goods term comes from, right? But what you're really trying to do is make sure that you have the sort of infrastructure for your community to thrive. So public goods funding in this way, if you sort of take that lens, is making sure you have people who, don't have to close down their nonprofits to go build something that can get these alternate funding mechanisms and start adopting your technology and getting that virtuous cycle going of users, usage, fees going back through your system, but then also making sure you're constantly seeding that back out, right? I don't think any economy should be completely extractive, so I really think the L2s have built this really kind of into their protocols to decide we're going to take some portion of our treasury or our fees or however to make sure there's a constant stream going back out. And then the problem becomes, what's the optimal way to allocate that capital?
I want to get a little bit out into the frontier here, and that brings us to retroactive public goods funding. And this is, I think, in contrast to Gitcoin's model, which is more proactive, is in hey, I think this thing will be useful in the future. Or I know there's this thing that's already been useful to me, and I want to see that reward, and that's the Gitcoin quadratic funding model. And then there's the Optimism retroactive public goods model. Same, but different. Ben, can you kind of walk us through the comparing and contrasting of how are these things the same, but how does the retroactive part change the dynamic of how retroactive how public goods funding is expressed?
Sure. So, okay, first of all, major shouts out to Gitcoin. This is like a little on the down low, so like this is some alpha if you're watching this online. If you're the person tuning into Rollup Day public goods, there's a little bit. The new modular code base that Gitcoin has is great. Some of our retro funding in the future will run off of that, so that's awesome. Okay, but what is retroactive public goods funding? The basic premise is that we should fund things that have contributed towards the impact that we want to see after the fact instead of beforehand. So why do you want to do this? The main argument is that it should be easier to know what had a positive impact after the fact than it is up front. And this is something that we see all the time. I don't know if it's, I think it's actually like an urban legend, but it's still a great analogy of the story of like cobras in India at one point. The government said, we're going to fund anyone who contributes to solving our cobra infestation by submitting dead snakes to the government. And what people started doing was farming these cobras as a way to get these rewards, right? So you don't always know up front if the thing that you want to happen or the way that you want to have an impact is going to have the impact that you expect, right? Because the end result of that was more cobras out there than less. So that's the main argument for why you should do funding public goods retroactively. I would say mechanically, like the other concrete difference that you can get is now you basically have a future expectation of funding that is going to come in towards projects. And the natural question that arises from that is, okay, retroactive funding sounds great. Sure, maybe you can allocate funding more efficiently, but how are these people going to pay their rent and eat in between the period when they're working on these public goods and funding them? So this gets into the concept of basically like creating vessels for people to invest in public goods up front. And the idea is that a market should actually be better in figuring out what, even up front, what are the right public goods, what are the right actions to take to cause the impact that you want to have than any one central org would be. So the idea of retroactive funding is basically, it's easier to figure out in the past what worked well than what will work well in the future. And then to get people the money today, the market should actually be able to make opinionated bets on what is going to be retro-funded and pay for rent and food in the meantime. So there's a little overview.
Yeah, I can jump in. Sure. I mean, I think they're really kind of two sides of the same marketplace, I think, right? So if we're helping kind of bootstrap projects and get them off the ground, there's this place where eventually they kind of graduate, right? So we have some projects that have been in round 1 through 15 now, and they are kind of relying on Gitcoin as the sustaining thing. And as we continue to evolve their protocol, it can be a little painful because we're not necessarily built to be someone's always on funding, right? And this is where I think something like retroactive would make a lot of sense, right? To come in and say, okay, this project has delivered value over and over and over for the years. Let's let our community turn this kind of always on, aqueduct of funding and keep them going. So I think it's brilliant. I also think there's some corollary to this concept of impact certs and hyper certs that Protocol Labs has been talking a lot about, which is this idea of if you're like an early investor in a public good, right? If you're part of a Gitcoin round, there should be this market later on, which is saying that thing actually had an outsized impact. Let's start buying these really impactful sort of whatever they might be, social innovations or software projects, fund them later, kind of once the sort of value has increased. And you can kind of create this analogy to sort of VC funding, right? They're sort of like angel all the way up to Series C, D. And I think that this is kind of what we're talking about is this graduation of bootstrapping and the early risk. We don't know if this team can pull this off or if this will have much impact, but people want to try, right? So many ideas, many small bets, and those graduating into these larger, sort of more sustaining funding models.
Public goods, VCs, that's the golden future that we want to get to, Now the tech influencers that are talking about what, what protocols are good or bad can put their money where their mouth is and benefit everyone in the process.
I really like that analogy of starting with the angels and then at the end of the road are is A16Z to be the ultimate last buyer of the asset or whatever. And there's always been this conversation, and I remember this super clearly in the ICO mania, which brought me into the space. Is yes, ICOs, we fixed the ability to democratize the access for investment. Turns out we didn't do that, but that was the energy, right? And we still see this. We still see that energy in the crypto space, where all these retail investors want to see VCs disrupted, and they want to be the early ones. And this has always been a core promise of the crypto spaces. The individuals are at the frontier, no longer the big institutions. And so Is that kind of what you see with this whole like retroactive public goods model, where you actually are like the individuals who are sifting through alpha on Gitcoin, saying like, ooh, that's a really awesome retroactive public good thing, I'll invest in that one, and this is this like new surface area for democratizing access to both upside for public goods and also upside for like the small fry that puts in $15 or $100 or something. Is this kind of the vision that you guys see?
I mean, yes, I think if your output is impact, right? Like if we're not talking about necessarily like 10x returns on your 15, whatever, like your small investment, I think the idea of bootstrapping an innovative project that's going to make some impact in the world, or like solve a technical need that you have through open source, these things are great to get off the ground. And really, truly, they don't have other ways of funding. Like you lived this, right? Like you cannot get funding for open source software for like projects like this. So we're building this completely new funding mechanism, and that's great to see it graduating into these like more sort of institutional spaces of always on or significant funding.
How do you see the innovations going on Optimism, the retroactive public goods innovations and experiments at Gitcoin? Like, is Gitcoin like, hey, that's a cool experiment over there, or are you guys like, hey, like we're gonna copy that? Like, what's going on the Gitcoin side of things?
I don't know if we're copying. I mean, we're working together. Yeah. I mean, to make it happen, right? So.
I mean, to re-ask the question, retroactive public goods is also going to become a core pillar of Gitcoin itself?
Yeah, so I mean, the goal of the grants protocol is to be modular, right? So you want to use pairwise quadratic funding and run your own round just like Gitcoin. Be my guest, you've got that ability. If you want to change that and do some sort of like token gating, quadratic voting, which is actually kind of more the mechanism that we're seeing in RPGF, like that's going to be an option for you as well. You might be able to use Macy in the future, a variety of other sort of mechanisms that you can use for how you want to actually do that voting and sort of the initial sort of, what is the wisdom of the crowd? How are you going to source that? And how are you going to get that to define where this pool of capital you've allocated goes to? We want to have a variety of mechanisms. It's open. We hope people here will contribute and build their own and build on top of what we're building. Yeah, maybe that's where I'll stop.
Sure.
Yeah.
Ben, one question I've had about this retroactive public goods model is that I'm worried it might actually bring in like a new like lobbyist sector of people lobbying for donate to my thing, and all of a sudden like it becomes a little bit more political and a little bit more gameable. Have you guys thought about this and how to prevent this world from happening?
Most definitely we have, and like there's a few sides to that coin, right? Like no pun intended. One side of that coin is just like you got to try something, right? So like the fact that there's a risk doesn't mean that you shouldn't make an attempt, and it's like you have some possible future you could reach or no chance of reaching it, right? But there's a lot that you can do in terms of trying to prevent those outcomes. So there's a couple things. So a very important thing for Optimism was that we decided that our governance system must have a co-equal house of governance, which is called the Citizens House, which is one person, one vote. Right? So there's a huge vector of plutocratic token voting attacks that you must be able to put in check. And so humans are how we want to do that. Secondly, Kevin just mentioned Macy, and it's true that there's a lot of work that you can do on the infrastructure side to try to minimize the ability of these kinds of outcomes of people trying to manipulate votes. So like bribery is a big one that is specific for Macy. So Macy stands for Minimal Anti-Collusion Infrastructure. Thanks. And the idea is that you should create use cryptographic mechanisms to make it impossible to de-anonymize votes. Right? So like right now we see a lot of voting just out in the public, right? You just like on the chain, you can see how everyone has voted, right? You can imagine a future which I think is important where you can't see who has voted so far, and the votes are only revealed once once it's time to tally everyone's vote up. But even then, it's problematic because you're de-anonymizing. So Macy is a even further better instantiation of this that says there are cryptographic mechanisms in place that it's kind of like ZK proofs. We know that the result of this vote was X, but we do not know who voted for and who voted against. And in fact, even if they wanted to try to prove which way they voted, they could not based on the fundamental cryptographic assumptions. So putting it at the social layer to prevent plutocracy is one of the things. And then just in terms of the infrastructure, making it hard AF to break these things with other contracts and other mechanisms are both super important things.
Yeah, so to summarize that, the people that might be the subject of lobbying efforts and bribes, right? These people, the citizens of the Optimism House, maybe people are coming to them and say, hey, I'll pay you $1 bajillion to do this thing. And they're like, yes, I'll do it. and then they actually can't prove that they've done it in the first place to anyone. And so if you're going to accept that bribe, whoever's paying that bribe is actually just taking it on faith that you are doing the thing that you do, and you can't actually do, or you don't have the ability to prove that you did it. And so you might as well actually just vote with your values and also collect the bribe. Still corrupt, but at least it doesn't corrupt the protocol, which is important.
Anti-collusion, baby. Exactly right.
I think we're coming up on time a little bit. Oh, 5 minutes? We got some more time. Cool, tight. Ben, can you kind of like walk us through like a sci-fi narrative story? Can you make up a story of of a cool, awesome retroactive public good process? Can you just like speed run through a future example of some thing that gets funded with retroactive public goods and like start at like month 1, year 1, year 3? Like, how does that start? Can you just tell us the story of how it might go?
Yeah, sure. So I think, okay, I have a new framework that I've been working on that I'll just quickly show. There's 3 steps to retroactive public goods funding that you do repeatedly. Cool. Step 1 is impact scoping. It's basically everyone who's going to be controlling where these funds are going says, okay, what is the future impact that we want to see that we will reward retroactively? You achieve social consensus on that. Your goal is to make that as clear as possible so that people will contribute upfront with the expectation of future reward. Step 2 is impact scoring. So everyone goes and says, how much impact do we think every project has? Step 3 is impact settlement. You take all those scores, you aggregate them via quadratic mechanisms or whatever, and you turn those into payouts for those projects. So this is going to be something that we'll see in the Optimism community and in anyone else that does RPGF do as a repeated process, basically. And so I think what you're asking is, what is the sci-fi world in the long-term future of what is the consensus that we decide around what we're going to fund, and how does that play out? So I think the singularity is obviously where you have to take this if you want a sci-fi answer, David. Like, right now, we are seeing an explosion of artificial intelligence. Like, I don't know if y'all have used the DALL-Es and the Stable Diffusions and all this, but this is crazy. Like, I used to pride myself on my ability to Photoshop things, and I'm realizing that's just like a dying industry. Like, no longer do I have exclusive access among my friend group to like meme my buddy onto a stupid face or whatever, right? So I think a huge thing that we're going to see in the future is when the super AI comes around, we need to provide a value system that works for both the humans and the AIs. And so at the end of the day, like, this is a huge, there's actually just a paper on this, on the idea that there's a concern that the AI is going to game whatever reward mechanism we give them to short circuit and give itself more reward instead of having the impact that we desire. And so I think there's an argument that in the long-term future, Optimism has a massive citizens house, globally connected, internet of value with the blockchain. And what we're doing is really laying the groundwork for what are the values that we want to see the AI complete, because they're going to be the best ones. They're going to dominate the stock market. They're going to dominate everything. And we use the retroactive rewards to keep them in check and to align, incentives so that we're not squashed, in an effort to create a bajillion paperclips.
I love the long-term thinking. This still long-term, but much less long-term than that. The idea for public goods funding and the Ethereum ecosystem has always been to hey, we need to bootstrap our own ecosystems. But to me, that's always been you put on your own oxygen mask first before you help with the others. The idea is to eventually scale public goods funding to the world, not outside of Ethereum. So maybe you can also tell a story, maybe a shorter time frame story about how does Optimism go from just funding and bootstrapping its own ecosystem to I don't know, fixing the potholes in some rural town in some country somewhere.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very deep, philosophical question. We all have this sense that these blockchains are these sort of digital nation-state collective things somewhere between a company and a nation, and right? So there's very philosophical questions embedded in there. I think at the end of the day, when we start to look beyond what is the next frontier beyond blockchain scaling with public goods funding? I think the next frontier is still going to be software, because we're going to learn a lot about how to fund and incentivize open source software development. And although we in the blockchain community, have an easy time forgetting this, there's a huge amount of very important open source and pieces of software out there that are not aligned with the incentives of humans and that dominate our lives. So I think the next step we'll see after getting really good at funding blockchain public goods is going to be other open source alternatives to basically applications that are not Web3, but are replacements to the horrible Web2 systems we have today. Not all those require tokens and money and funding. And so that's going to be the next thing. Slowly over time, as more people join the collective and as more people are a part of these online communities, I think we will start to see it permeate into the real world and outside of software. I also think that we'll start to see, like to the AI point, I think we'll start to see basically like hosted non-blockchain applications whose impacts are being funded by these mechanisms as well. So slowly over time, we'll go from open source blockchains to open source applications beyond blockchains, and finally will permeate into the real world. And exactly how that works is like an incredible political, philosophical question that we could talk for another 5 hours about.
Right. It's one of those things where like step 1, step 2, step 3, question mark, question mark, question mark, step 4, we
Profit.
do it. Yeah. Kevin at Gitcoin, how do you guys think about scaling public goods beyond crypto?
I think the biggest thing for us is making that ability for small local communities to fund their needs. That's really what it comes down to. So I really think one of the, I think, major flaws in kind of current nation states, right, is the inability to sense and respond at a local level. So giving this ability for people to decide to fix the pothole in their street potentially individually by collecting their activities, funding those themselves, or through these sort of online mechanisms, making it where these online communities can have a lower lift to get into funding their own grants programs and sort of plugging into these larger streams of funding. So I think it's sort of fractal, getting lots and lots of small communities funding their shared needs, and those laddering up into larger and larger projects. So I kind of look at it as sort of a bottoms-up kind of view of the world.
As we close out here, let's make things like super specific. What's the call to action that you need at Gitcoin to help that world come about faster? What do you need people to do?
I need people to look at Passport and try to use it, tell us how to make it better. When the grants protocol is live, try to use it, try to build on it, try to use it for your communities, make that the sort of like basic capital allocation substrate for all of Web3.
Ben, what do you guys need at Optimism? What do you need people to do?
So definitely go use Gitcoin because we're also going to be using their stack for the next thing. Beyond that, I would say don't forget why you are here. I think time and time again, especially through cycles of crypto, we see a really exciting value proposition and a really exciting piece of the future that we're getting a glimpse at be totally distracted and moved offside by desire for quick buck and a desire to cookie cutter, copy paste the things that have been working so far. So I would say use Gitcoin and don't forget why the fuck we're here. Pardon my French.
You're here.
Thanks, guys.